The fluorescent lights of Gate 27 hummed overhead, casting everything in that peculiar airport pallor that made even healthy people look half dead. I suppose that was fitting because I felt like I was running on fumes in desperation, my double shift at the diner still clinging to my clothes and the faint smell of coffee and grease that no amount of hurried hand-washing in the airport bathroom could quite eliminate. Sophie's small hand gripped mine as we rushed toward the gate, her little backpack bouncing against her shoulders, and I mentally calculated for the 1,000th time whether I'd made the right choice buying these tickets instead of waiting for Catherine's surgery results over the phone. But she was my sister, my only family besides Sophie, and the thought of her going through emergency surgery alone made my chest constrict. The gate agent looked up as we approached, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to something resembling pity as she took in my rumpled scrubs and Sophie's slightly too small jacket. "We're upgrading you to first class," she said, her fingers clicking across the keyboard. "Overbooking in economy." I blinked, too tired to properly process this stroke of impossible luck, just nodding and accepting the new boarding passes like they might dissolve if I questioned them. Sophie tugged my hand excitedly as we entered the boarding area, her 4-year-old eyes going wide at the spacious leather seats and the general atmosphere of hushed wealth. That was when I saw him. He sat in the corner of the first-class waiting area like a king holding court, though his court seemed particularly hostile. 3 men in dark suits occupied the seats around him in a configuration that seemed casual but wasn't, their eyes constantly scanning, their bodies positioned to create a barrier between him and everyone else. But it was him who made my exhausted brain suddenly snap to attention. He wore a suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, charcoal gray and perfectly tailored to a body that suggested he did more than sit behind a desk all day. His dark hair was styled with that careless precision that actually required effort, and his face was all sharp angles and brutal elegance, the kind of masculine beauty that came with a warning label. His eyes were the color of smoke before a fire, gray and cold and assessing as they swept the gate area with predatory awareness. Then those eyes landed on me. I felt the impact like a physical thing, a jolt of recognition, though I'd never seen him before in my life. For a heartbeat, something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, before the shutters came down and he was once again perfectly controlled. I looked away quickly, heart hammering for reasons I couldn't name, and guided Sophie toward the only available seats. Right next to him. His men shifted, tension radiating from them like heat shimmer off summer pavement. One of them leaned close to whisper something, but the man held up one hand in a gesture of such casual authority that the other fell silent immediately. I settled Sophie into her seat and sank down beside her, every muscle in my body screaming its gratitude. I should probably be worried about the strange territorial energy radiating from our neighbors, but exhaustion made me reckless. I closed my eyes for just a moment. "Mommy," Sophie's voice piped up beside me, "why does that man look so angry? Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you." My eyes snapped open at Sophie's innocent observation, mortification flooding through me as I realized she was staring directly at the dangerous man beside us, and before I could stop her, she was pulling out her juice box from her backpack, the one I'd hastily grabbed from our apartment before rushing to catch our flight. She fumbled with the little straw, her 4-year-old fingers not quite coordinated enough, and I reached to help her, but in that split second of movement, the juice box slipped, arced through the air in what felt like slow motion, and exploded directly onto the lap of that expensive charcoal suit. I froze, watching apple juice seep into fabric that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and the temperature in our little corner of the gate area dropped about 20 degrees as his men tensed, their hands moving in ways that made my survival instincts scream. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," I gasped, grabbing napkins from my bag, my hands shaking as I leaned toward him, trying to blot the spreading stain. Sophie's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes as she realized what she'd done, and I was already calculating how much a suit like that cost to clean, whether I could skip meals for a week to cover it, when his hand caught my wrist, stopping my frantic dabbing. His touch was warm, firm, and I looked up into those smoke-gray eyes now only inches from mine. "It's fine," he said, and his voice was different than I expected, cultured and deep with an edge that suggested crossing him would be the last mistake someone made. But there was something else underneath, something almost amused. His men looked like they'd witnessed a miracle. I felt tears burning my own eyes now, exhaustion and stress, and this stupid juice making everything feel insurmountable. "I can pay for the cleaning," I heard myself say, knowing I couldn't, not really, not without making this month even tighter than it already was. He released my wrist, leaned back in his seat, and studied me with an intensity that made me feel like he could read every desperate calculation running through my head. "No need," he said simply. Then looked at Sophie, who was still on the verge of tears. "Accidents happen. What's your name?" "Sophie," my daughter whispered. And I should have stopped this interaction, should have gathered our things and moved to different seats, but I was trapped by exhaustion and his unexpected kindness. "I'm Alexander," he told her. And then to my complete shock, he smiled at her, a small thing that transformed his brutal features into something almost human. Sophie's tears stopped, as if by magic. The gate agent's voice crackled over the speaker, announcing another delay, 3 more hours due to the storm system that showed no signs of moving, and I felt what little energy I had left drain away. Alexander glanced at the window where rain lashed against the glass, then back at me. "Flying to Chicago?" he asked, and I found myself nodding. "My sister," I managed. "She had emergency surgery this morning. I need to be there." I don't know why I was telling this stranger my business, except that something about the way he listened, complete focused attention, made words spill out. "I work 2 jobs, couldn't get anyone to watch Sophie on such short notice, so she's coming with me, and I'm probably crazy for flying during a storm with a 4-year-old, but Catherine doesn't have anyone else." I stopped myself, realizing I was rambling, but Alexander just nodded as if this made perfect sense. Sophie had already pulled out her coloring book, the juice incident apparently forgotten with the resilience of childhood, and she spread it across the empty seat between us, her crayons rolling across the leather. Alexander watched her with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between fascination and confusion, like she was a creature from another planet. His men had relaxed slightly, though they still watched us with the wariness of guard dogs, unsure if we were threat or guest. The gate agent's voice crackled through the speaker again around 9 p.m., apologetic and resigned as she announced the flight was canceled until morning, and I felt my carefully held composure begin to crack because I couldn't afford a hotel, not even a cheap one, not with the hospital bills Catherine would face and Sophie's daycare payment due next week. I was calculating whether we could sleep in the airport when Alexander's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts, low and certain as he said the airline would provide hotel accommodation and he'd make sure we were taken care of. I turned to look at him, exhaustion making me slow to process his words, and I saw something in those gray eyes that made my breath catch, a kind of focused intention that should have frightened me, but instead felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in days. "I can't accept that," I heard myself say, even as every muscle in my body screamed for a bed, but he was already standing, gesturing to one of his men who materialized beside him with the silent efficiency of long practice. "It's handled," Alexander said, and there was no room for argument in his tone, the voice of someone accustomed to his words becoming reality. Sophie was already half asleep against my side, her small body heavy with the particular weight of an exhausted child, and I found myself nodding, because what choice did I have, pride or rest? And rest was winning. Within 20 minutes, we were in a sleek black car, Sophie curled on my lap, driving through rain-slicked streets toward a hotel that made my breath stop when we pulled up, because this wasn't airline accommodation. This was the kind of place I'd only seen in magazines. Alexander's man, introduced briefly as James with a handshake that felt like an assessment, checked us in while Alexander stood slightly apart, phone to his ear speaking in low tones that carried the weight of command. The suite they brought us to was larger than my entire apartment, all cream and gold and floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city lights refracted through rain. Sophie woke enough to gasp at the sight, and I stood frozen in the doorway until Alexander appeared beside me, so close I could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that spoke of a world I didn't belong in. "The connecting door," James said, gesturing to a door on the far wall, "leads to Mr. Tremayne's suite," and I realized with a jolt that Alexander would be right there, separated by just a door and whatever distance we chose to maintain. James and the other men left after checking every corner of the suite with professional thoroughness that made my stomach flutter nervously. And then it was just us, Sophie running to explore the enormous bathroom while Alexander stood in our doorway looking oddly uncertain. "I should let you rest," he said, but he didn't move, and neither did I, caught in the strange intimacy of this impossible situation. "Thank you," I managed, feeling the words inadequate for hotel suites and patience with juice-stained suits and whatever this protection was he'd wrapped around us. He nodded, stepped back toward his own suite, then paused and looked back at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "If you need anything," he said, and left the rest unfinished, closing the connecting door between us with a soft click that felt loaded with meaning. I put Sophie to bed in sheets that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her small body starfished across a mattress big enough for 4 people, and I stood there looking at my daughter and wondering what I'd stumbled into and whether I should be more afraid than I was. The knock on the connecting door came at 7 in the morning, soft and hesitant, and I jerked awake from restless sleep, still dressed in yesterday's clothes because I'd been too exhausted to even change. For a terrifying second I thought it was Alexander, and my heart did something complicated in my chest. But when I opened the door, Sophie stood there in her pajamas, backpack slung over one shoulder, looking up at me with that particular determination that meant she'd made up her mind about something. She slipped past me before I could react, padding across the suite toward Alexander's door, and I lunged after her, whispering her name urgently, because disturbing dangerous men at 7 a.m. seemed like a spectacularly bad idea. Sophie knocked on his door with the confidence of someone who'd never learned to fear anything, and I reached her just as the door opened to reveal Alexander in dark gray pants and a white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, hair still damp from a shower, looking more human and somehow more dangerous without the armor of his suit. He looked at Sophie, then at me hovering behind her in rumpled clothes and tangled hair, and something flickered in those smoke-gray eyes that made my skin warm. Sophie asked him to have breakfast with us in that direct way children have, and I started to apologize, to say we didn't mean to bother him, but he was already nodding and saying he'd be glad to, his voice carrying that same careful gentleness he used with her. 30 minutes later, we sat in the hotel restaurant, an odd trio that must have looked bizarre to anyone paying attention. Sophie between us chattering about the big bathtub and the fancy soaps, while Alexander listened with focused attention I was starting to recognize as fundamental to who he was. I'd showered and changed into the same jeans and sweater from yesterday, my only clothes, and I felt shabby next to his casual elegance even without the suit. But when I caught him looking at me, there was nothing dismissive in his gaze. We talked more easily than I expected, the strangeness of the situation somehow making normal small talk feel absurd, so I found myself telling him about Catherine, how she'd raised me after our parents died, how she'd worked 3 jobs to put me through nursing school until I got pregnant and had to drop out. I didn't mention Sophie's father except to say he wasn't in the picture, watching Alexander's jaw tighten in a way that suggested he had opinions about men who abandoned their children. He told me his full name, Alexander Tremayne, that he had business interests in Chicago, Nothing specific, but the way he said it carried weight. While Sophie colored on the children's menu, I pulled out my phone and Googled him as subtly as I could, finding only vague references to investments and real estate. Nothing concrete, but the kind of nothing that suggested deliberate obscurity. I looked up to find him watching me with something like amusement, and I had the uncomfortable feeling he knew exactly what I'd just done and found it reasonable. My phone rang, and the gate agent informed me our flight was delayed again until evening, and I felt my chest tighten thinking about missing more visiting hours, about Catherine alone and scared in that hospital. Alexander set down his coffee and offered his car service to take me to the hospital now, his tone matter-of-fact like it was the obvious solution, and I immediately refused because this was too much. I'd already accepted a hotel room and breakfast, and I couldn't keep taking from this man I didn't know. He insisted with that quiet certainty I was learning meant the decision was already made, and I found myself agreeing because what I wanted and what Sophie needed were becoming two different things. The car was nothing like the vehicles I'd grown up with, all leather and silence and glass that made the rainy city look like a painting, and Sophie pressed her nose against the window, asking questions about every building while Alexander sat across from us, making occasional low responses that suggested he was actually listening. I watched him when he wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the man who patiently answered a 4-year-old's questions with the man whose employees moved like soldiers and who commanded hotel suites with a phone call, and I couldn't quite make the pieces fit into anything that made sense. The hospital was the same as every hospital, fluorescent and antiseptic, and when Alexander followed us inside, I turned to tell him he didn't need to stay, but he was already gesturing toward the elevator with that quiet certainty I was learning meant arguing was pointless. Catherine was in a private room on the 5th floor, still groggy from anesthesia, but alert enough that her eyes went sharp and suspicious the moment Alexander stepped in behind me, and I saw her take in his expensive clothes and controlled posture, and something like fear crossed her face. She asked to speak to me alone with pointed emphasis, and Alexander nodded and left with Sophie, saying something about finding hot chocolate that made my daughter's face light up. And the moment the door closed, Catherine grabbed my wrist hard enough to hurt. She asked who he was in that tone she used to use when I came home late in high school, and I realized I had no good answer because what could I say? He's someone I met yesterday who bought me a hotel room, and I think he might be dangerous, but he's kind to Sophie, and I feel safer with him than I have in years. Catherine said she knew dangerous men when she saw them, that our father had been one before he died, that she'd spent her whole life making sure I never ended up with someone like that, and I felt anger flash hot in my chest because I'd spent my whole life taking care of myself, and I didn't need her warnings now. I told her Alexander had helped us, that he'd been nothing but generous, and even as I said it, I could hear how naive I sounded. But Catherine just looked at me with something like grief and said that's how it always starts. I left before we could fight properly because I didn't have the energy and she needed to rest, finding Alexander and Sophie in the cafeteria where he'd bought her hot chocolate with whipped cream and was listening with apparent genuine interest to her explanation of her favorite cartoon. His phone kept buzzing against the table, lighting up with calls he ignored, and I saw tension gathering in his shoulders each time, the careful control slipping just slightly. I told him I needed to go back and sit with Catherine for a while, trying to establish some distance from whatever this was between us, and he nodded and said he'd wait here with Sophie if that was all right, and I agreed, because what else could I do? Catherine was more alert when I returned, coherent enough to apologize for being harsh, but not coherent enough to take back the warning, and we talked about her surgery and recovery and carefully avoided the subject of the man downstairs. An hour passed, then another, and when I finally went back to collect Sophie, I found Alexander standing apart from the table on his phone, his voice low and hard in a language I didn't recognize, and everything about his posture screamed threat. He saw me, and the transformation was instant, the hardness sliding away behind controlled courtesy, but I'd seen what was underneath now, and my stomach went cold. The ride back to the hotel was silent except for Sophie's chatter about the fish tank in the hospital lobby, and I felt the distance between us growing with each block, This man who was a stranger turning back into a stranger right in front of me. He offered to have his driver take us anywhere we needed, his tone perfectly polite and perfectly empty. And I heard myself thanking him with matching politeness. And Sophie looked between us with confusion, because children always know when something's wrong. The car pulled up to the hotel entrance, and I felt the tension drain from my shoulders because we were back, and I could retreat to our room and figure out how to politely disentangle myself from whatever this was with Alexander. But then a black SUV cut sharply across our path, and everything happened faster than I could process. The SUV doors opened, and 4 men emerged, dressed in dark clothes with faces that looked carved from violence. And Alexander moved before I could even register the threat, his hand reaching back to push me and Sophie behind him with brutal efficiency. His driver was suddenly out of the car with a gun drawn, and I stopped breathing because this wasn't real. Things like this didn't happen in my life, but Sophie was clutching my leg and whimpering, and the men were advancing toward us with predatory certainty. The leader spoke in that same language I'd heard Alexander use earlier, his tone demanding, and Alexander responded with words that sounded like ground glass, his whole body positioned as a barrier between us and them. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I understood the threat in their posture, the way they kept glancing at me and Sophie like we were commodities being evaluated, and terror locked my throat closed. The leader switched to English and said Alexander needed to come with them right now, that Mr. Drummond wanted to have a conversation, and Alexander's laugh was the coldest sound I'd ever heard, empty of anything human. He refused in a voice so calm it was terrifying, and I realized this was who he really was beneath the careful courtesy, this man who faced armed threats without flinching. And I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't work. The leader's eyes slid to me and he smiled, said something about Alexander's pretty traveling companion, and Alexander moved faster than should have been possible for someone his size, closing the distance and disarming the man before I could blink. And suddenly, Alexander held a gun pressed against the man's temple with absolute certainty. His voice dropped to something lethal and precise, telling them to go back to Drummond and say he'd meet tonight as planned. But if any of them ever looked at her again, if they ever thought about her again, the territory war would start right here in this driveway, and it would end with all of them dead. The other men shifted but didn't advance, some calculation happening in their faces, and after a moment that stretched like hours, the leader nodded carefully, and Alexander released him with a shove that sent him stumbling. They retreated to their SUV and drove away, and only then did Alexander turn to face me, and I saw the exact moment he registered the terror in my eyes, the way I was clutching Sophie who was crying into my shoulder, the way I'd finally understood exactly what he was. More cars arrived, men in suits moving efficiently to surround us, and a man with steel-gray hair approached Alexander speaking urgently, and I heard Alexander tell him to arrange a different hotel, somewhere private and secure, his tone accepting no argument. I found my voice finally, shaking but determined, and said we were leaving, going home on the next available flight, and Alexander's eyes met mine with something that looked almost like regret. He said quietly, precisely, that I couldn't leave, not yet, because those men had seen me with him, and Drummond would use that, and I felt the trap close around us like jaws. Alexander's voice was quiet in the car, controlled in that way I was beginning to recognize, meant he was containing something volatile, and he explained with precise economy that Drummond's men had seen me with him, photographed me and Sophie, and would absolutely use us as leverage if we tried to simply return to our normal lives unprotected. I felt anger surge hot through the fear, anger at him for dragging us into this, at myself for accepting his help, at the universe for putting us in that airport seat next to a man whose world contained threats and violence I'd never imagined. And I told him this wasn't my life, my voice shaking but firm. He agreed immediately, no deflection, said it was entirely his fault and he would fix it. And something about his certainty made it worse because it confirmed everything Catherine had tried to warn me about. The safe house was 40 minutes outside the city, down increasingly isolated roads until we turned onto a private drive flanked by stone walls and iron gates that opened at our approach. And the house itself was beautiful in that sterile way of places, designed for function rather than living, all clean lines and expensive furniture and windows that probably cost more than my annual salary. Guards were everywhere, men in dark suits with vigilant eyes who nodded to Alexander and ignored me completely. And I felt Sophie's hand tighten in mine as she registered the strangeness of this place. Alexander dismissed most of his men with brief instructions, keeping only 4 visible around the property's perimeter, and then he turned to face me in the vast living room, and I saw him brace himself for what was coming. I demanded answers, my voice harder than I'd known I could make it, asked him directly who he was and what exactly we'd gotten caught in the middle of. He told me a version of the truth, carefully edited, said he ran an organization with business interests that sometimes conflicted with other organizations, that Drummond was a rival who'd been encroaching on territory, that the meeting tonight was meant to resolve things peacefully. I heard everything he didn't say in the spaces between words, and I called him what he was. Said the word criminal with all the accusation I could pack into it, and he didn't deny it, just watched me with those dark eyes that gave nothing away. I told him to let us go, knowing even as I said it, that I had no power here, no leverage, nothing but the hope that he actually was the man who'd bought Sophie hot chocolate instead of the man who'd held a gun to someone's head. He said 48 hours, his voice gentle but immovable, said the meeting with Drummond would settle the territory dispute, and then I'd be free to go with protection in place until the threat fully dissolved. Sophie started crying then, picking up on my fear and the tension crackling between us, and I watched something shift in Alexander's expression as he looked at my daughter, something that looked almost like pain. I gathered Sophie into my arms and carried her to the bedroom Alexander indicated, closing the door on him and his impossible situation, and spent 20 minutes soothing her fears with lies about everything being an adventure. When she finally fell asleep for her nap, exhausted by emotion she couldn't understand, I returned to the living room where Alexander stood by the window looking out at his guards, and I asked him point blank if he killed people. The silence stretched between us, answer enough, and when I asked if he would hurt us, his eyes met mine with startling intensity, and he said he would die first. And I heard absolute truth in those 4 words. I didn't know what to do with that truth, with this man who was both threat and protection, with my complete lack of choices. So I just stood there while he watched me with something that looked like regret, and the afternoon sun slanted through expensive windows onto carpet my feet had no business touching, and I wondered how a delayed flight had brought me to this impossible moment where my daughter's safety depended on a criminal's word. The afternoon settled into strange stillness, with Sophie still napping, and me trapped in this beautiful prison with a man I should fear, but couldn't quite manage to, and I watched him work at the dining table with his laptop open and his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in that fluid language I couldn't identify, watching the way his face shifted into cold calculation when he discussed whatever dark business required his attention. He was wearing different clothes now, casual pants, and a dark shirt that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. And I found myself studying him the way I might study a predator at the zoo, fascinated and afraid in equal measure, trying to reconcile the man who'd held a gun to someone's head with the man who'd sat patiently through Sophie's endless questions. I made coffee in the pristine kitchen because I needed something to do with my hands, something normal to anchor myself, and on impulse I poured a second cup and brought it to him, not sure if this was a peace offering or Stockholm Syndrome taking root already. He looked up when I approached, surprise flickering across his face before he accepted the cup with a quiet thank you, and I sat down across from him because standing felt too much like retreat. We talked carefully, dancing around the real questions, and he asked about Sophie's father with studied casualness that didn't hide his interest. I told him the truth I rarely shared, that Marcus had left 2 weeks after I told him I was pregnant, said he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility, and I'd never heard from him again beyond signing away his parental rights. Alexander's jaw tightened, and something dark passed through his eyes, and he said any man who'd walk away from his own child was worse than worthless, and I heard genuine anger there that surprised me. I asked if he had family, knowing I was crossing into territory he'd marked as forbidden, and he was silent so long I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he said not anymore, tone flat and final. I waited, and after another long moment he added that he'd had a sister once, and the past tense landed like a stone in still water. I didn't push, heard the grief beneath those words, and the silence between us shifted into something less hostile, almost companionable, two wounded people recognizing pain in each other. Sophie's voice broke the moment, calling for me, and I found her awake and disoriented in the unfamiliar room, and I brought her out to the living room, where she immediately brightened seeing Alexander, and begged him to play a game with her. I expected him to refuse, to retreat into his work, but he surprised me by agreeing, and I watched this dangerous criminal sit on the floor with my 4-year-old daughter and play Candyland with awkward concentration, clearly having no experience with children, but trying anyway. Sophie explained the rules with her patient seriousness, and Alexander listened like she was briefing him on tactical operations, and something in my chest cracked open watching them, something dangerous and impossible. He was terrible at the game, drew the wrong cards and moved to wrong spaces, and Sophie corrected him with giggly authority. And when he finally won by sheer luck, she clapped for him like he'd accomplished something magnificent. He caught me watching, and our eyes locked across the bright, scattered game pieces, and I saw the question in his face, felt the heat rising between us like a physical force, attraction I had no business feeling for a man whose life was built on violence, and I couldn't look away. Evening arrived with the weight of inevitability, the light outside shifting to deep gold, and then amber as shadows lengthened across the safe house grounds, and I felt the change in atmosphere before I understood what was happening. Felt Alexander's attention shift from the strange domestic bubble we'd created back to the dangerous world waiting beyond these walls. James arrived just after 6, his face grim and professional, and I heard them talking in low, urgent voices in the next room, caught words like position and backup and acceptable losses, and my stomach turned cold, understanding that this was the reality of Alexander's life, that violence was being planned with the same clinical efficiency most people use to plan business meetings. Alexander emerged wearing a dark suit that made him look like exactly what he was, powerful and lethal, and he was checking something at his waist, adjusting his jacket, and I saw the gun tucked into a holster at his side and felt my breath catch in my throat. He noticed me watching from across the room, and something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been regret, and he crossed to me with that predatory grace I'd become familiar with. He told me James and 6 men would stay at the safe house, that I was completely safe, his voice calm and certain, and I heard myself ask if he was safe, the question escaping before I could stop it, surprising us both with its naked concern. He almost smiled then, a slight curve of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes, and said he was always careful, had been doing this a long time, but I saw the lie in the careful way he didn't promise to come back unharmed. We stood there with maybe 2 feet between us, and it felt like miles, felt like the distance between his world and mine was a chasm neither of us could really cross. And I wanted to say something, wanted to tell him to be careful, or don't go, or come back to me. But Sophie called my name from the other room, and the moment shattered. Alexander's eyes held mine for another heartbeat, and then he turned and walked out, James following, and I moved to the window and watched the cars disappear down the long driveway, taillights fading into gathering dusk. James had left one of his men to coordinate with the perimeter guards, a younger guy who looked uncomfortable with domestic duty, and he asked if Sophie and I wanted dinner, his politeness awkward, and I said yes because I needed to feed my daughter, even though the thought of food made me nauseous. Sophie was unusually quiet during the meal, picking at her chicken, and she asked when Alexander was coming back, if he was okay, and I lied to her with a smile and said, of course, he just had a work meeting, Everything was fine. I hated lying to my daughter, hated Alexander for putting me in this position where I had to pretend the man she was starting to trust wasn't walking into potential violence, hated myself for caring so much when I'd known him barely 2 days. I put Sophie to bed around 8, read her 3 stories and sang her favorite song, and she finally fell asleep with her hand curled around my finger. And I sat there in the dark watching her breathe and praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore, that Alexander would come back alive. Midnight came and went with no word, the house silent except for quiet footsteps of guards, changing positions outside. And at 1 a.m. I gave up pretending I could sleep and went to the living room where I found James on his phone having a tense conversation in clipped sentences. He saw me and ended the call quickly, but not before I heard him say secure the exit route and prep the medical supplies, and my heart started hammering against my ribs. I asked him what was wrong, and he said nothing with the kind of professional blankness that confirmed everything was very wrong, and I sat down on the couch with a book I didn't read while the clock ticked toward 2 a.m., and then past it, each minute stretching into eternity, while I waited for news I was terrified to receive. The sound of car engines brought me to my feet at 3 a.m., heart hammering as I moved to the window and saw headlights cutting through the darkness. And my breath stopped completely when the vehicles pulled up and men emerged from the lead car supporting Alexander between them, his white shirt dark with blood that looked black in the harsh security lights. I was running before I made the conscious decision to move, pushing past James, who materialized trying to stop me, and I burst through the front door into the cold night air just as Alexander looked up and saw me. And something shifted in his face as he pulled away from his men and told them he was fine in that commanding voice that somehow still worked even when he was clearly hurt. He walked toward me under his own power, but I could see the careful way he moved, the stiffness in his left side, the way his right hand pressed against his ribs, and when he got close enough, I could see his face was pale beneath the outdoor lights, and there was blood on his collar, and I felt my nursing training kick in, overriding the fear that wanted to paralyze me. I demanded to see his injuries, my voice sharper than I intended, and he said it was nothing, just a scratch, trying to move past me toward the house, but I stepped into his path and didn't back down. And our eyes met and held for a long moment, before he finally nodded once and let me guide him inside. James cleared the room of the other men with quick efficiency, and I was distantly aware of them filing out and closing the door behind them, but my focus was entirely on Alexander as he sat heavily on the leather couch and began unbuttoning his ruined shirt with movements that were slower and more careful than his usual predatory grace. I helped him shrug out of the jacket and shirt, my hands steadier than I felt inside. And I had to breathe through my mouth when I saw the damage, a bullet graze along his left side that had torn through skin and muscle, still bleeding sluggishly, and a deeper knife wound on his right shoulder that someone had clearly tried to field dress, but needed proper attention. I sent James for the first aid kit I'd seen in the bathroom earlier, and warm water and clean towels, and when he returned I knelt beside the couch and began cleaning the wounds, while Alexander watched my face with an intensity that made my hands want to shake, but I forced them to remain steady. His skin was warm under my fingers despite the blood loss, and I could feel the hard muscle beneath as I worked. And I made myself focus on the clinical task rather than the intimacy of touching him this way, of being so close I could smell his cologne mixed with copper and gunpowder. I asked what happened, keeping my voice level, and he told me in short sentences that Drummond had rejected his terms and ambushed his car when he was leaving the meeting, that his men had returned fire and gotten him out, but it had been close, too close, and it was not over, would not be over until one of them backed down or died. My hands stilled on his skin at those words, the reality of his world crashing over me again, and he covered my hand with his, stopping my movement, and said my name softly, Eleanor, and thanked me for taking care of him. I looked up and met his eyes, and saw exhaustion there, and pain he was containing behind iron control, but also something else, something raw and vulnerable that made my chest ache, a loneliness that mirrored the empty places inside myself that I pretended did not exist. I should have stepped back then, should have put professional distance between us, should have finished bandaging him, and walked away to check on Sophie, who was miraculously still sleeping through everything, but I did not move, and neither did he. His hand came up to my face, fingers tracing my cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who had just survived an attempted murder, and I found myself leaning into his touch like a flower turning towards sunlight, and his thumb brushed across my lips, and I heard his breath catch. This was insane, was every kind of wrong, but we were both broken people recognizing the fractures in each other, and when he pulled me closer, I went willingly, drawn by gravity I could not resist and did not want to. Alexander stopped when our faces were inches apart, his breath warm against my lips, and he said my name like a warning, Eleanor, and told me this could not happen, that I deserved normal and safe, deserved a man who came home at reasonable hours from an office job and did not have bullet wounds. But I laughed, and it came out bitter and raw, and I said my normal was working myself to exhaustion at 2 jobs and barely surviving, counting pennies to buy Sophie new shoes, eating ramen so she could have fresh vegetables, lying awake terrified about rent and medical bills, and a future that looked exactly like my grinding present stretching endlessly forward. He said his life was violence and darkness, that people died in his world, that he had blood on his hands that would never wash clean, and I met his eyes and said mine was lonely and hard, that I went to bed alone every night aching with an emptiness that had nothing to do with money, that I had not been touched gently by another human being in so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted rather than needed. He cupped my face with both hands, his palms rough and warm against my cheeks, and asked me what I wanted, really wanted, his voice dropping low and intimate, and I said I did not know, was not sure I remembered how to want things for myself rather than for Sophie, but I was tired of being alone, tired of being strong, tired of carrying everything by myself with no one to help shoulder the weight. He kissed me then, finally closing that last inch between us, and his lips were surprisingly gentle against mine, despite everything I knew he was capable of, despite the violence he had enacted just hours ago, and I kissed him back, my hands sliding up to his neck, careful to avoid the bandaged shoulder, fingers threading into his hair. Heat built between us fast and fierce, years of loneliness on both sides dissolving in the connection, and he pulled me closer, his hands sliding down my back, and then he was pulling me onto his lap and I went willingly, straddling him on the couch, my body pressed against his, feeling his heart hammering against my chest matching the wild rhythm of my own. His hands were in my hair, tilting my head to deepen the kiss, and I could taste coffee and something darker, and my mind was screaming that this was a mistake, that I barely knew him, that he was dangerous and wounded and everything I should run from, but my body did not care, responding to his touch like it had been waiting for exactly this, for him. He made a sound low in his throat and shifted beneath me and then winced, his injured side protesting the movement, and reality crashed back as I felt him tense with pain. I pulled back immediately, breathing hard, remembering the bandages beneath his shirt, the blood I had cleaned away, and he tried to pull me back down, his eyes dark and wanting. But I shook my head and said not while he was hurt, not here with his men outside and my daughter sleeping down the hall, not like this. I stood up, putting physical distance between us because I did not trust myself to stay close and maintain any kind of sense, and he watched me with predatory intensity that made my stomach flip, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his hair disheveled from my fingers. He told me that when this was over, when I was safe and free to make choices without fear or obligation, he wanted to see me again, wanted to try whatever this was between us, and I asked why. What possible future could we have? A single mother and a criminal. How could that ever work? He had no answer, just looked at me with raw honesty and longing, and I turned and walked away before I could change my mind, returning to the room where Sophie slept peacefully, unaware of everything crumbling and reforming around us. and I lay down beside my daughter and did not sleep for the rest of the night, my body still humming with want, my mind racing through impossible scenarios, wondering what I had just started and whether I would survive where it led. Morning light filtered through the safe house windows when I woke after maybe 90 minutes of broken sleep, and I found Alexander already awake in the main room, fully dressed and on his phone making arrangements in that clipped, authoritative tone. And when he saw me, he ended the call and told me he was arranging our return home, hiring a permanent security detail to watch over me and Sophie until the situation with Drummond was fully resolved. I said no immediately, said I wanted my normal life back, wanted to take my daughter home and pretend none of this had happened, go back to my cramped apartment and exhausting jobs and predictable safe existence, but he shook his head and said Drummond knew about me now, had seen me with him, would use that information however he could, and I needed protection whether I wanted it or not. I asked how the situation got resolved, what that actually meant, and his silence was answer enough, and I felt cold wash through me as I understood he was planning to kill Drummond or be killed himself, that this ended only one way in his world. I asked him not to kill anyone because of me, my voice breaking on the words, and he looked at me with something like regret and said it was beyond that now, that the territory war was coming regardless of what happened between us, and I knew he was lying to spare me the guilt, but I could not argue because Sophie appeared rubbing her eyes and asking about breakfast. Alexander was arranging plates when James burst in without knocking, his face pale and urgent, and he said they had a situation. That Drummond had taken Catherine from the hospital an hour ago, had left a message demanding Alexander come alone and unarmed to an address on the south side, trade himself for her, and everyone in the room knew it was a trap, knew Drummond would kill them both. I heard the words like they were coming from underwater. My sister. My sister taken because of me, because she had been in that hospital room when I visited, because someone had followed us or made the connection, and I was moving toward James demanding details before I consciously decided to act. And Alexander was already on his phone barking orders about reconnaissance and positioning while I stood there shaking with terror and rage. He started planning the rescue immediately, tactical discussion with James about entry points and timing, and I said I was coming with them. Had to be there for Catherine, and he said absolutely not, did not even look at me, kept planning, and I raised my voice and said she would not trust his men, would be terrified, needed a familiar face, needed me. He finally turned and looked at me and said no, in a voice that allowed no argument, and something snapped inside me, all the fear and helplessness of the past 2 days exploding outward, and I was shouting that this was my fault, my sister, my choice. And he was shouting back that he would not risk me, would not let me walk into that building, and our voices rose until Sophie started crying, and we both stopped and looked at her small, frightened face. Alexander stared at me across the room, really seeing me for the first time since James had arrived, and I made my voice calm and said please, said I understood the risk, but I could not let Catherine face this alone, could not sit safe while my sister was terrified because of choices I had made. And something shifted in his expression as he recognized the steel beneath my fear, the same protective fierceness he had seen me show Sophie now directed at my sister, and he closed his eyes and made a decision I could see him hating. He said I could come, but I stayed in the armored car with 3 guards, did not leave the vehicle for any reason, did not enter the building no matter what I heard or saw, and James started to protest that this was insane, but Alexander silenced him with a look, and I agreed immediately before he could change his mind, and James muttered that Alexander had lost his mind, and maybe he had, maybe we both had. The warehouse sat on the industrial south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where broken windows outnumbered intact ones, and rusted chain-link fences enclosed empty lots filled with debris. And I watched it from inside the armored car Alexander had positioned 100 yards away, with 3 guards whose names I did not know surrounding me, their weapons visible and ready. Alexander had gone inside 10 minutes ago with James and 2 other men, and I could see the building's entrance but nothing beyond, and the not knowing was eating me alive. my imagination conjuring horrors worse than reality could possibly deliver. The guard nearest me was watching the building through binoculars and speaking quietly into his radio, receiving updates from men positioned on rooftops and in vehicles around the perimeter, and I caught fragments about positions secure and targets acquired and wait for signal. Then the guard lowered his binoculars, and I saw his body language change, tension rippling through him, and he spoke rapidly into the radio, and I heard Catherine's name, and hostage confirmed and negotiation in progress, and suddenly I could see her in my mind. My sister tied to a chair, bruised and terrified because of me, because she had been unlucky enough to be in that hospital when Drummond's men were looking for leverage. The guard turned away to consult with his partner, and I made my decision in that instant, not thinking, just moving, my hand finding the door handle and pushing it open before anyone could stop me. I was out of the car and running toward the warehouse before the nearest guard realized what was happening. His shout of alarm behind me as my feet hit pavement, and I heard him following, but I was faster, desperation driving me forward across the empty lot toward a side entrance I had seen. I reached the door and pulled it open, and the guard caught up to me, hissing that I needed to return to the vehicle immediately. But I was already inside, and he had no choice but to follow me, his weapon drawn, his face furious. Inside the warehouse was dim and cold, vast empty space broken by support columns and old equipment, and I could hear voices echoing from somewhere ahead. Alexander's voice and another man's, and I moved toward the sound with the guard beside me, radiating anger, but staying close to protect me since he could not force me back. We rounded a stack of old pallets, and suddenly I could see them in the open space beyond. Alexander standing with James and his men facing a group of 5 others, and in the center was Catherine tied to a metal chair, her face bruised and streaked with tears, and the man I assumed was Drummond standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder, his other hand holding a gun. I heard Drummond demanding that Alexander cede all Chicago territory and operations, his voice smug and certain, and Alexander was stalling, his posture deceptively relaxed, and I realized his men outside were moving into position while he kept Drummond talking. Catherine's eyes were closed, and I could see her lips moving in what might have been prayer, and something broke inside me at the sight of her fear, and I was moving forward again before the guard could grab me, running into the open space shouting Catherine's name. Everything happened at once, time fragmenting into disconnected images. Drummond's men turning toward me, weapons rising, Alexander's face transforming from controlled negotiation to pure fear as he saw me, James shouting orders, Drummond swinging his gun from Catherine toward me. Alexander moving faster than should be possible, crossing the distance between us. The deafening crack of gunfire erupting from multiple directions. Alexander's body slamming into mine, taking me down, his weight covering me completely. More gunfire, the sound overwhelming in the enclosed space. Catherine screaming my name, Alexander's men securing the room with brutal efficiency, James taking down 2 of Drummond's men while others fell to bullets from the positioned snipers outside. Drummond on the ground, wounded but alive. His gun several feet away where Alexander had shot it from his hand. Then Alexander was pulling me to my feet, his hands gripping my arms hard enough to bruise, and his face was terrible, fury and fear warring for dominance, and he demanded what I had been thinking, his voice raw. I pointed to Catherine still tied to the chair, sobbing with relief, and I said she was my sister, and he had no argument against that. Nothing to say that could override the simple truth that I could not abandon her. James was already on his phone calling in an anonymous tip to police about a kidnapping in progress, and he told us we had maybe 5 minutes before sirens arrived, and we needed to be gone. We returned to the safe house 40 minutes later, with Catherine wrapped in a blanket between Eleanor and me in the back seat, her hands still shaking from shock. And Eleanor held her sister close, murmuring reassurances, while I watched them both and calculated the distance I would need to put between us to keep them truly safe. James had called ahead, and the safe house was prepared with a doctor waiting to examine Catherine, and she was treated for bruises and minor cuts and dehydration, while Eleanor hovered nearby, refusing to leave her side. and I stood in the doorway watching this fierce, protective love between sisters and feeling like an intruder in something pure. Catherine was given sedatives to help her sleep, and Eleanor settled her in one of the bedrooms. And when she emerged an hour later, I was waiting in the living room, rehearsing words I did not want to say. And she looked exhausted and wrecked and still somehow beautiful. I told her I had arranged transportation home for both of them tomorrow morning, a private plane that would take them back with a full security detail that would remain in place indefinitely, and she stood very still listening as I explained that Drummond had been arrested on trafficking charges with evidence my people had planted, that he would be in prison for 20 years minimum, that she was safe now, free to go, free to return to her life. I said all of this without meeting her eyes, because I knew if I looked at her, I would ask her to stay, and that would be the most selfish thing I had ever done. She asked if that was what I wanted, her voice quiet and careful, and I said it was what she needed, what Sophie needed, what Catherine needed, and she took a step closer and asked again what I wanted. And the question hung in the air between us heavy with everything we had not said. I finally looked at her then and let her see the raw truth I had been hiding, and I told her I wanted her in my life, her and Sophie, wanted to try something real despite having no idea how to do that, but I knew I was poison, and my world was darkness and violence, and she deserved so much better than anything I could offer. Eleanor closed the distance between us and looked up at me with those eyes that had seen me at my worst and somehow had not looked away, and she said she was not fragile, that she had survived poverty and abandonment and single motherhood, that she was stronger than I gave her credit for. I touched her face because I could not help myself and said I knew her strength, that it was what had drawn me from the first moment. But knowing her strength did not change what I was. She said then, "Teach me to be dangerous too," and I almost smiled at the fierceness in her voice. She asked if I could step back from the violence, transition more toward legitimate business, be less soldier and more businessman. And I forced myself to be honest and said I did not know if I could change that fundamentally, that this life was all I had known for 15 years. She said, "Try, just try, for us, for Sophie," and I looked past her to where her daughter was playing with blocks in the corner, this sweet, innocent child who deserved safety and stability. And I asked Eleanor if she really wanted this life for her daughter. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and then said no, she did not want this life for Sophie, but maybe I could have a different life too. Maybe we could build something new together. 6 months had passed since that conversation at the safe house. 6 months of slow transformation that felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly fast. And now I stood in Alexander's penthouse that had become our home, looking at my reflection in the full-length mirror, wearing an elegant black dress he had bought me for tonight's formal dinner with his business associates. Sophie was spending the evening with Catherine, whose wariness toward Alexander had softened slightly after watching her sister become genuinely happy for the first time in years, and the apartment felt too quiet without my daughter's presence, even though I knew she was safe and loved. Alexander emerged from his study adjusting his tie with fingers that were not quite steady, and I watched him in the mirror, noting the tension in his shoulders. This man who faced enemies without flinching, nervous about introducing me to his world. The past 6 months had been a careful dance of mutual transformation, him slowly transitioning toward legitimate business operations and distancing himself from the violent enforcement that had defined his empire. A process that met resistance from old guard members who did not trust this softening of their leader. He came home to me every night though, sometimes exhausted, sometimes frustrated, sometimes with shadows in his eyes that told me the darkness still called to him, but he came home. Sophie had started calling him Alex 3 months ago, a moment that had made his breath catch and his eyes go suspiciously bright. And she trusted him now in the uncomplicated way of children who knew when someone would protect them. He had enrolled me in nursing school over my protests about the cost, paying my tuition, and arranging my schedule so I could still be present for Sophie, giving me back the dream I had abandoned years ago. In return, I taught him things he had forgotten or never known: how to be gentle, how to exist in normalcy, how family felt when it was chosen rather than inherited or enforced. Neither of us was fully transformed. He was still hard and dangerous, with violence coded into his muscles and reflexes, and I was still wary and fiercely independent, refusing to become dependent on his wealth or protection. But we were trying, learning each other's languages, building something new from our broken pieces. He taught me self-defense in his private gym, how to shoot at the range he owned, how to move through his world with awareness and capability, never wanting me helpless again. I asked him what was wrong as he struggled with his tie, and he turned to me, taking my hands in his, and he said these people were his world, the business associates and organization leaders who had followed him for years, and he wanted them to accept me, needed them to see what he saw. I stepped closer, asking what happened if they did not accept me, and he pulled me against him, saying, "Then they did not matter. Only I mattered. Only Sophie mattered. Only this fragile new life we were building." I kissed him, telling him we would face them together the way we had faced everything else these past months. And he reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet box that made my breath catch in my throat. He opened it, revealing a ring that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant fragments. And he said he knew 6 months was fast, knew his world was still complicated and dangerous, knew we had obstacles ahead, but he had never been more certain of anything, and he asked me to marry him. I looked at the ring, at his face showing vulnerability he rarely allowed, at the future stretching ahead full of uncertainty and challenge, and this impossible love we had found in the least likely place. And I thought of my lonely past and Sophie's future, and this dangerous, complicated man who had chosen to try to be better. I said yes, the words simple and clear, and he kissed me with a desperation that spoke of how much my answer mattered, how much we both had riding on this fragile thing between us. We would face whatever came next together, his darkness and my light finding balance, building something neither of us had thought possible, love born from a delayed flight and nurtured through danger into something real and lasting, our forever beginning now.